There are important connections between failing at intimate relationships and being a poor user of language. I'll repeat that again. There are important connections between failing at intimate relationships and being a poor user of language. One of many very precisely and thoughtfully worded sentences taken from Mcgill. So we're helping you with your love life here in English 281, as well as with your thinking about writing about literature. In departure from my usual practice, I'm offering you this lecture as something that should be following rather than preceding the Mcgill reading that I assigned you. So again, you should be reading the Mcgill reading before you watch this lecture. Usually you would read it after. I'm offering, as I say in the schedule of readings, I want you to pay attention to your attention as you read. I hope you did so if you already read it. Noticing where you drift, where you have to double back and read sentences again. And I also challenged you to try reading passages in the Mcgill aloud, or reading all of the Mcgill aloud. So I'm going to move forward with this lecture, assuming that you have already done that. If you haven't, please go back and do that before continuing. So pause me here. And even if you have if you haven't had a chance to read the Mcgill aloud, go do it now. Find a passage or set of paragraphs, 3 paragraphs that even that little, or 3 or more paragraphs that particularly struck you, and try reading them aloud. And do that before continuing. So, how was it? My guess is that you likely found the Mcgill easier to read, or at least potentially less fatiguing to read, than any of the other scholarly works we've read yet this term. My guess is that when you read it aloud, you were less inclined to trip up over your words than you might have been reading other scholarly texts, potentially. Now, this is not to say that the other scholarly writers we've looked at this term so far are fatiguing at all in their style or argumentation. They are all obviously damn good at what they do, which is why we invite them here, and which is why they are published in academic texts and here at the University of Toronto. But the fact is that academic writing, as we've discussed in class so candidly, is by its very nature a complicated endeavor. Now, we'll have another conversation as the term goes on about complexity as an object in itself. It's one of the 12 criteria we're going to be talking about. But suffice to say for now that if the issue at hand is not deeply complicated, and if your argumentation is not a complex journey through that complication, there's no point in writing an essay, right? If you have 1,500 words that you've been assigned to write, that means that you're assigned to think with the level of depth and complexity that requires the fullness of 1,500 words to get across. So a 5,000 word work or a 10,000 word work of literary scholarship, most articles fall within that range, is an argument complex enough that you need 5,000 to 10,000 words to get it across in its fullness, wasting none of those words, right? But here's the key. When you do so, the onus is also on you as a writer to get that argumentation across with as much clarity, economy, and precision as possible. And I think that Mcgill is especially good at precision. What do I mean by these terms? Now, I've been using these 12 criteria around which I organize the class. And I want to call myself out and say I'm using those words in purposefully somewhat ambiguous ways, right? So each of those words is meant as a broad umbrella that collects a set of comments that I and other professors tend to make on papers. So they're just sort of like mnemonic devices, right? Thinking about things related to clarity, we talk about X, etc., etc. So they are not the fullness of what each of those words means with as much precision as maybe I'd like. So when I say clarity in this class, when I talk about the criterion of clarity, and I invented these usages, or I developed these usages for this class and for similar uses. By clarity, I mean using as many words and as much grammatical complexity as is necessary to get your complex thought across as thoroughly and effectively as possible. So spelling it out, showing your work, being grammatically correct or being grammatically sensible so that the fullness of your logical thought comes across. I oppose clarity to economy, right? By economy, I mean using as few words and as little grammatical complexity as are necessary to thoroughly and effectively communicate your complex thought. That means cutting away the words that aren't necessary to achieve clarity. Finding the balance between those two is really key. So with those in mind, what do I mean by precision here? What do I want you to think about when I say precision? I mean using the right words. It's not about number, it's about choosing the right words and the right grammatical structures to communicate the complexity of your thought as accurately as possible. Finding the right word to correspond as closely as possible to the concept you're thinking of. And even more importantly, perhaps, finding the right word that will be understood as close to the concept you're thinking of as possible. It's that last one, precision, that truly, I think, cuts down on readerly fatigue and makes it easier to read something out loud. And I think Mcgill is a master at it. I think all of the texts we've read are masterful at it, but I see it in Mcgill in particular. I'll be curious to hear whether your experience of reading the Mcgill supports my opinion about that. It helps, too, that Mcgill's subject is Monroe, a particularly readable literary text. But consider this Mcgill passage. I'll read it to you in full. Grant, seeing, and as I read it, just pay attention to how clear and precise it is. Grant, seeing that Fiona has started putting labels on kitchen drawers to identify what they contain, recalls an anecdote, quote, about the German soldiers on border patrol in Czechoslovakia during the war. End quote. According to Grant's recollection of the anecdote, notice how we've interrupted that here, right? According to Grant's recollection of the anecdote, quote, each of the patrol dogs wore a sign that had said Hund. Why? Said the Czechs, and the Germans said, because that is a Hund. The story suggests that for the fascist mind, an appeal of labels is that they facilitate a fantasy of control over others' identity. By assigning labels to a fellow creature, one can embrace the illusion that one has contained and established authority with respect to the creature. At the same time, the soldier's desire to label the dogs with signs expresses a fear that the dogs could otherwise slip free of their names and be something other than Hunds. Thus, the act of labeling shows the fascist mentality reacting to its own horrifying awareness that the signifier and signified are tethered to each other only contingently, and that language does not provide the stable order a fascist might prefer. The soldiers, for all their insistence that a dog is a Hund, have an implicit fear of linguistic habit breaking down and of signifiers detaching from what they usually denote. Now that's pretty complicated, but it's not hard to follow, because in every case, the words mean pretty exactly what they mean. You see how Mcgill is isolating the complexity of meaning in that quickly passing German soldier scene. You pass pretty quickly in the Monroe story, right? He parses it into describable threads in order to articulate with precision how that story functions in the story. Are you attending to how his argumentation here has enriched your understanding of and even your appreciation and enjoyment of Monroe's work? Now, I want to use this passage, too, not only to demonstrate precise writing, but also to introduce or clarify some terms, or define some terms. Let's talk a bit about the idea of signifier and signified that he talks about here, as well as denote, right at the bottom, and its partner, connote. The idea of signifier and signified, I'll go over these briefly, analyzes a mental process that is at the heart of writing, which most readers take largely for granted, and which is the primary engine of literary ambiguity. My definitions here, by the way, of all of these terms are rough. They're rough working definitions. They will deviate from and glance over more technical or advanced definitions of these terms in semiotics, philosophy, literary theory, etc. So let me just say that ahead of time and say the signifier is usually the word. We might more broadly say the sign, but let's say the word. The signifier is the word. The signified, or the referent, he also says referent in this text. The referent, or the signified, is what the word points to. So we have the word Hund, dog in English. Let's say you have the word dog, then you have an actual dog, right? The signifier is the word dog, the signified being the actual dog. The word signifies the animal, but in doing so, it also signifies the class of animals to which that particular dog belongs, right? That's the ability of the signifier to call something dog, also being its ability to group that thing together with everything else that might be called dog in opposition to what can't be, right? So when I say, that dog across the street, that's a dog, that means that I'm associating that dog with my idea of dog, which is based on my idea of all dogs and not, say, non-dogs, right? Okay, right? When I do so, when I call a dog, when I call a Hund, the very idea of dog is thus reinforced and created over and over and over, but in a slightly different way each time. To call something something, to call a dog in a meaningful way, is a complex process, right? So it helps to distinguish, for our purposes, different ways of bearing meaning. So let's talk about what we mean when a word denotes something. It's the same passage here. For our purposes, and again, rough definitions, when we talk about what a word denotes, its denotation, we usually mean its most immediate signification in whatever context we've used it, right? When we read, we register all the multiple possible meanings of a word, right? For instance, to dog somebody is to follow them or to annoy them. I'm dog tired, dog days of summer, or whatever, right? There's all different meanings of dog. When we read, we register, right? We see a word and we register at some level all the different possible meanings of the word, but we quickly arrange those meanings into an ad hoc hierarchy with one at the top. So if I said, there's a dog in the window across the street, there is actually, usually. There's a dog in the window across the street. You know, I probably don't mean a hot dog. I probably don't mean the idea of dog tired. I probably mean the animal, a dog. So immediately you arrange the possible meanings of dog into a shape, and the one at the top is its denotation. Of course, the question of which meaning of a given usage of a word, right? And again, it's context. It's the sentence in which it appears that determines which meaning is at the top, which is its denotation. The question of which meaning of a given usage of a word is often a slippery one, right? So deciding what is a word's denotation can be a slippery one. And that slipperiness is often exploited effectively by literary authors. This is one of those kinds of ambiguity. So for instance, if I may, right? Grant tells her, this is again quoting Mcgill, quoting Monroe, "I've brought a surprise for you. Do you remember Aubrey?" The story continues. She stared at him for a moment as if waves of wind had come beating into her face, into her head, pulling everything to rags. "Names elude me," she said harshly. Then the look passed away as she retrieved with an effort some bantering grace. She set the book down carefully and stood up and lifted her arms to put them around him. Her skin or her breath gave off a faint new smell, a smell that seemed to him like that of the stems of cut flowers left too long in their water. Mcgill interprets this. Look at this, she stared at him first. Because the proper name preceding the sentence that begins, "She stared at him," is Aubrey. Readers can be forgiven if they momentarily take the him, at whom Fiona stares and whom she embraces, put them around him, to be Aubrey, not Grant. Right? We read it again, we realize in the context of the story, she's talking about Grant, right? Accordingly, there is an arresting irony in the phrase, "names elude me," for names are, in a sense, eluding readers too. It is only with the phrase, "a smell that seemed to him," that the scene identifies the him as Grant, given that he is the center of the story's that he is the story's center of consciousness. I wasn't thrown by Mcgill's prose there. I was thrown by trying to figure out where I was in the slide, by the way. It's a very readable passage. Did you take a double take moment when you read "She stared at him"? Did you even notice? I did. I definitely did. To be honest, the first time I was reading this story was to decide whether to assign it. I read it once and didn't even realize that when I was reading this, I did think it was Aubrey at first, and then realized that the him is Grant. Totally. I don't know if you did too, but notice that Mcgill, in order to express this very complex use of ambiguity, or this very nuanced use of ambiguity that Monroe does here, he has to be completely unambiguous in his wording to get it across. So notice again, Monroe is using imprecise wording for literary effect. In order to describe it, Mcgill is using utterly precise wording. Notice how he really, really breaks down which him he's talking about and why. Notice even that the way he breaks up the quote makes clear what the context is, what he's focusing on, what precedes what, etc. So that's an example both of what denotation is and also how a literary writer might use it or use ambiguity in denotation. Again, the question is not what can the word mean, but denotation is what does the word immediately mean, and messing with that. So beyond denotation, when we talk about all the meanings being arranged into an ad hoc hierarchy, all the rest of the meanings that don't disappear, that are still attached to your interpretation, are the connotations of a given word or phrase, the echoes and resonances of all the other things a word means. All right? So again, if the reading involves an ad hoc arrangement of meanings into a sudden hierarchy, right? So the dog went across the street. I know that dog can mean other things, but it probably mean the animal. That's the one that hits the top of the hierarchy. The word's connotations are the rungs below the top one. The lower but still active and relevant rungs on the hierarchy, as well as perhaps the word's full range of possible meanings across social, historical, linguistic, other contexts. The trick about connotation, to not move into the realm of total bullshit, is to be conscious of proximity, to be conscious of how close or how far a connotation is to the usage in which the word is found. The closer it is up the rungs, I'd say, the more relevant it is in your attempt to work through the complexity of meaning, right? So the various meanings of fine and silly. Why isn't this here? Oh, well, it isn't. Sorry. Slide problems. The various meanings of, here it is. The various meanings of fine and silly, as right here, are arranged by Mcgill in rough order of relative relevance, right? So he talks about all the different ambiguities around silly. Clearly, we know what silly means, that, or we don't exactly clearly know at a denotative level what silly means. He writes here, if she is using the word silly to mean ridiculous, then X, probably she is also using it somewhat ironically. Those are denotative. But then he says, one might recall too that silly has historically meant not just lacking sense, it has also meant deserving of pity and sympathy, as well as innocent and feeble. Now, he's not saying that that is what Monroe is trying to denote, what Monroe denotes, or oh gosh, I've forgotten her name. Fiona. What Fiona is trying to denote when she says the word silly. But he's saying that silly also has connotations. It has other echoes of words. One might recall that silly has historically meant not just lacking sense, it also has meant deserving of pity and sympathy, as well as innocent and feeble. Moreover, notice he's moving even further away from the likely denotation. The word's Middle English root, seli, means happy. And he goes on about that, right? So the fact that silly has an etymological echo in its medieval meaning is farther from the context of Monroe's story than the other meanings of silly he suggests. But then again, Mcgill reminds us that Grant is a medieval literature scholar, so there's possibly a way of drawing that connotation a bit closer. And you have to decide case by case whether you are stretching too far out of the sort of perceived sphere of relevant connotation. Connotation is why rights, like, as Matthew Sergi writes and as Matthew Sergi states, that's why they don't mean the same thing, going back to my earlier lecture in your essay, right? Writes or says and states, let's say. Says and states do denote identically in certain contexts, but they bring with them different connotations, right? I would say something to my friend. I would state something for the court, right? They may denote identically, but they bring with them different connotations because words are unstable signifiers. Importantly, to write with precision using inherently unstable signifiers is not the same thing as having the fascist mentality that Mcgill is writing about. It is rather an acknowledgement of and management of the awareness that the signifier and the signified are tethered to each other only contingently, to paraphrase Mcgill. So when you're working on trying to keep the idea here adhering closely to a word, both here and when your reader hears it, right, you have to be respectful of the fact that signifier and signified have an unstable relationship. That's how you keep the reader from doubling back over, say, all the riches he has. So you choose every word with care. Note, right, the care used by Mcgill. That much is obvious in the text. Less obvious is the story's suggestion that Alzheimer's is not the beginning of Fiona and Grant's problems, and that neither are Grant's adulteries. Rather, the story shows the couple's marriage to have long been dogged by Grant's unfortunate interpersonal and linguistic habits exposed and disturbed by Fiona's development of Alzheimer's and by her relocation to Meadow Lake. This is an object lesson in both precision and clarity, I think. We repeat the word obvious twice. That much is obvious. Less obvious is, because it is precisely what we mean both times. We are not altering our wording to avoid repetition. Repetition is making things clearer here. If we did not repeat that exact word, the logical structure of what Mcgill is saying would be lost or less clear. That much is obvious. less obvious is. Then we repeat the verb to be, right? Alzheimer's is not the beginning, and neither are Grant's adulteries, right? Habits exposed by and disturbed by X end by Y. You follow this when you follow this. Did you notice how he used the word dogged, by the way? I was thinking about it, so it did trip me up a little. Can you feel Mcgill making you a more precise writer as you read his work? Perhaps you should read more of his work. He's a novelist too, by the way. And notice just how many times Mcgill uses variations on the word, that's odd, uses variation on the word particularly. That's not this slide. Anyway, whatever. Mcgill uses a lot of variations on the word particularly. I'll just read you the quotes. That was supposed to be this quote. When he says particularly, he means it every time. Not especially, not very, not uniquely, particularly. He says, a life that has been particularly dyadic, not least because they do not have children, at page 66. At page 68, Fiona and Grant have enjoyed a particularly intimate relationship. And then at page 84, he says, in contrast, he draws the bear came over the mountain, the story, in contrast with the way that Grant reads. And he says, the bear itself, and this is one of his last sentences, with its fine, flowery, figurative language and its careful elucidation of character, models a sensitivity to particularity and to semantic complexity, including the ironies and divergent meanings that words can hold. So, here it is now. I'll leave you with a particularly nice passage of Mcgill. My challenge to you, I'm going to stop here and say, read over this bit, from by depicting down to regard to names. Mcgill's point here being, of course, that Monroe's story itself is pushing readers to read with more precision, more sensitive awareness to how language works. So I encourage you to read this aloud, if you haven't already. Even if you have already, read it aloud. And then as an experiment, I'd like you to try changing out 1 or 2 or 3 of these words with a near synonym. Choose something that means something like conventionally, but change it. Or limited, or perspective, right? What if you change that word out with something else? What does it do to the sentence? Then read the sentence aloud with the word switched. What changes? Read it again and again, if you would, just slightly changing the words. And let me know what happens. Let me know if you discover anything. Thanks.